In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Welcome to Journey to Jannah, where timeless wisdom meets the present day. Here we bring you audiobook-style biographies of the greatest minds in Islamic history, scholars, thinkers, and reformers who shaped the course of knowledge, faith, and civilization. From Imam Abu Hanifa to Ibn Sina, from Al-Ghazali to Sayyid Qutb, each story is a journey through trials, triumphs, and unwavering dedication to the pursuit of truth. Sit back, reflect, and let your heart travel through centuries of Islamic heritage. One voice, one story, one lesson at a time. Subscribe now and begin your journey toward knowledge, inspiration, and Jannah, inshallah. Journey to Jannah, where knowledge lives. Sha Waliullah Dehlawi, the torchbearer of revival, echoes from Delhi.
In the sweltering heat of 18th century Delhi, as the once mighty Mughal Empire staggered under the weight of political decay, foreign invasions, and social disarray, a new light flickered into existence, a light that would later illuminate the course of Islamic revivalism across the Indian subcontinent. Shah Waliullah Dehlawi was not born into peace, but into pressure. The era he inherited was one of chaos, but his vision was clear. His was a mission not of the sword, but of scholarship, not of conquest, but of correction. Through his intellect, pen, and relentless dedication, he would breathe life into a community on the verge of spiritual and intellectual collapse. This is not merely the biography of a man. It is the story of a movement, a ripple through time that touched scholars, mystics, jurists, rulers, and rebels alike. It is the story of a revivalist whose heart beat for justice, whose mind soared in scholarship, and whose soul longed for unity in a fractured world. Let us now journey back to the heart of Shah Jahanabad, Old Delhi, where the fragrance of rose petals and ink still mingles in the air of history, whispering tales of Shah Waliullah, the scholar who rose when an empire fell.
A child of the Mughal twilight, 1703.
The summer of 1703 was unforgiving. Dust clouds spun lazily above the stone streets of Delhi, the city still glimmering from the architectural splendor of Emperor Shah Jahan's age. But behind the grandeur, there was unease. Aurangzeb, the strict and aging emperor, sat upon a throne whose legs were beginning to creak. In a modest yet noble household, nestled within the scholarly quarters of Delhi, a cry pierced the thick, incense-laced air. A boy had been born to Shah Abdur Rahim, a respected theologian and a man known for his piety, depth of knowledge, and quiet strength. This boy would be named Qutb al-Din Ahmad, though history would come to know him simply as Shah Waliullah, the friend of Allah. Even in infancy, Waliullah was different. His eyes sparkled with curiosity, his ears drank in every word of Qur'an, and his hands reached for ink and parchment rather than toys. In a city ablaze with both culture and conflict, the child grew beneath the canopy of Qur'anic verses and classical commentaries. His father, Shah Abdur Rahim, had helped compile the Fatawa-e-Alamgiri, Aurangzeb's monumental compendium of Hanafi law. This was no ordinary scholar. He was a man of rigorous scholarship blended with deep Sufi spirituality. Under his careful guidance, Waliullah was not simply taught, he was cultivated. At the age of 7, Waliullah had already memorized the Quran, his voice soft but precise in the early morning hours when the azan echoed across the domes of Delhi. By 15, he had mastered logic, jurisprudence, and Arabic grammar, each word carved into his soul like calligraphy on parchment. But it was more than intellectual brilliance that defined him. From an early age, Waliullah showed signs of khushu, humility that turns knowledge into wisdom. While other boys played in the courtyards, he would sit by candlelight, poring over books of Hadith, his fingers tracing the delicate Arabic script, his heart yearning for a glimpse of the Prophet ﷺ through words. In those years, the shadow of his father loomed large, not as a burden, but as a guidepost. Shah Abdur Rahim taught not through severity, but through silence and example. When Waliullah faltered, reflection, not rebuke, was offered. It was in these gentle corrections that the young scholar learned the art of self-discipline. But fate would not allow such a blessed student to remain under his father's wing for long. In 1718, when Waliullah was just 15, Shah Abdur Rahim passed away. The blow was crushing. The only anchor in Waliullah's life had slipped beneath the waves of death. Yet in that grief, something profound was born. Alone but resolute, he took up the mantle left behind. That same year, he began teaching at the Madrasa-e-Rahimiyya, the very seminary his father had founded. Students older than him sat at his feet, not out of obligation, but out of awe. His depth of understanding, clarity of speech, and character were undeniable. Delhi, meanwhile, was changing. Aurangzeb had died in 1707, and with him, the last breath of centralized power. The Mughal throne became a puppet in the hands of court intrigues, regional governors, and foreign opportunists. Nadir Shah of Persia would soon descend upon Delhi like a vulture, and the Marathas would press from the south like a rising tide. It was in this boiling pot of decay, conflict, and despair that Shah Waliullah began to crystallize a vision, not just of survival, but of revival. As his fame spread across the intellectual circles of Delhi, a restlessness stirred within him. The Indian subcontinent, he felt, had become like a body with severed veins, disconnected from the heart of the Islamic world. He longed to travel, to drink directly from the fountains of knowledge in Mecca and Medina, to walk in the footsteps of scholars who traced their chains back to the Prophet ﷺ himself. That journey would soon come, but for now, the boy who once sat silently in his father's shadow was beginning to cast one of his own.
Journey to the Sacred Cities, 1730.
The streets of Delhi shimmered beneath the morning sun as Shah Waliullah stood at the city's edge, robes light and travel-stained, a small pack on his back, and a greater weight in his heart. He was 27 years old, and though already recognized as a towering scholar in India, he had grown painfully aware of a gap in his learning, a disconnection from the living tradition of Islamic scholarship in the heartlands of the Hijaz. He would not be content with books alone. He yearned to sit with the scholars of Mecca and Medina, to drink from the wells of Hadith, where they still ran pure and sweet. And so, in the year 1730, Common Era, Shah Waliullah embarked on the sacred journey of Hajj, but with a purpose far greater than pilgrimage. As the caravan moved westward, he rode in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his lips constantly whispering prayers. Nights were spent beneath stars, reciting Quran by firelight, his mind soaking in the verses with new meaning. Days were long, hot, and difficult, but he bore them like a man driven by destiny. After months of journeying through the harsh landscapes of Persia and Arabia, Waliullah finally arrived in Mecca. The city was alive with pilgrims, scholars, merchants, and mystics. The Kaaba stood at its center, like a black flame, drawing hearts near. And among those who circled it, seeking nearness to Allah, was the man from Delhi, humble, quiet, but filled with purpose. In the blessed precincts of the Haram, Shah Waliullah met scholars whose names were written in golden ink in the annals of knowledge. Chief among them was Sheikh Abu Tahir al-Kurdi, a towering authority in Hadith sciences. It was under his guidance that Waliullah began studying the Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and other Hadith collections. Line by line, isnad by isnad, Waliullah's mind expanded and his vision deepened. He was no longer just an Indian scholar. He was now connected to the living chain of Islamic scholarship, stretching back 14 centuries. The Hadith did more than inform him, it transformed him. He saw in it not just rulings and narrations, but the living soul of the Ummah, the beating heart of a civilization. Through it, he understood the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam more intimately as a teacher, leader, reformer, and guide. Yet it wasn't only Hadith that shaped him in the Hijaz. Waliullah spent time in Medina, the city of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, absorbing its serenity. He prayed in Masjid al-Nabawi, wept at the Prophet's grave, and found in its atmosphere the inner peace that had eluded him amid Delhi's rising turmoil. The scholars of the Hijaz, though diverse in origin and outlook, recognized something special in the man from Hind. They called him the Jewel of India and insisted that he not leave without obtaining full ijazah, authorization to teach and transmit what he had learned. When he departed, they embraced him like family. They gave him chains of transmission that would link India once again to the intellectual and spiritual centers of Islam. 2 years passed before Waliullah returned to Delhi, but he did not return the same man who had left. When he arrived back at the gates of the city in 1732, there was something different in his gait, something in the way his eyes held the horizon. He had returned not just as a scholar, but as a revivalist, a mujaddid. Delhi, however, was in worse shape than when he had left. The Mughal Empire had descended further into chaos. Bands of Maratha horsemen raided northern towns, and foreign mercenaries circled like jackals around a dying empire. The ulama were divided, the Sufis disoriented, and the masses spiritually starved. But Waliullah came bearing a flame, not a sword, and in his mind a singular question had begun to form, one that would define the rest of his life. How can this broken world be healed by the timeless message of Islam? To answer it, he would write, he would teach, he would reform, and he would call not just individuals, but entire institutions to turn back to the Qur'an and Sunnah, not merely as relics of the past, but as blueprints for the future. The revival had begun.
The pen and the pulse of the Ummah.
The call to Fajr echoed over the rooftops of Delhi, slicing through the stillness of dawn. In the modest madrasa his father had built, Shah Waliullah sat cross-legged on a straw mat, quill in hand, pages of parchment spread before him. His beard was streaked with the first signs of age, but his back remained straight, his eyes focused. He had returned from Hijaz, not with treasures of this world, but with something far more powerful: clarity. He understood, now more than ever, that the ailment gripping the Muslim world was not merely political or economic. It was spiritual and intellectual. Faith had become ritual. Scholarship had become imitation. The pulse of the Ummah was weak, because the heart, its connection to the Qur'an and Sunnah, had been neglected. So he began to write. And write he did. Shah Waliullah poured his soul into his ink. His books were not cold academic texts. They were messages to the heart of a wounded civilization. In eloquent Persian and classical Arabic, he authored works that would change the course of Islamic thought in India and beyond. His most monumental work was The Prosecution of Allah, the conclusive argument from God. In it, he explored not just the rulings of Islam, but the divine wisdom behind them. Why did Allah command what he did? What were the underlying goals of Sharia? How could these eternal principles be applied in a decaying world. He wrote not to impress, but to awaken. At the same time, Shah Waliullah was no armchair intellectual. His pen moved in rhythm with the pulse of the people. In the streets, prices soared. In homes, poverty deepened. The elite argued over inheritance, while peasants went hungry. He saw clearly that Islamic justice was not just a topic of fiqh, it was a lifeline. So he turned to translation. He made the first complete Persian translation of the Qur'an, so that ordinary Muslims, who no longer understood Arabic, could once again taste the sweetness of Allah's words. He was accused by some of innovation, but he pressed on. The Qur'an was not meant for scholars alone, he declared, but for every heart that beat with sincerity. In his lectures, students gathered from all corners of the subcontinent. Some came from as far as Bengal and Kabul, drawn by the light spreading from the Madrasa-e-Rahimiyya. Among his students were future reformers, jurists, mystics, and freedom fighters. But teaching was not enough. As political instability deepened, Shah Waliullah saw a storm coming. The Mughal Empire was rotting from within, and foreign powers, Persians, Afghans, and Europeans, hovered like vultures. The Marathas were rising in the south, and the British East India Company was quietly digging its roots in the east. He believed India needed a strong, just ruler, one who could restore order and protect the Muslims from both internal decay and external threats. And so, in a controversial but bold move, Shah Waliullah did something few scholars would dare. He reached out to Ahmad Shah Abdali, the Afghan king. He sent letters urging him to intervene in India, not as a conqueror, but as a protector of the faith and a restorer of justice. In doing so, Waliullah sought to prevent what he feared most, a Hindu-majority political dominance led by the Marathas that would marginalize Muslims further. Some criticized him for inviting a foreign power. But Shah Waliullah did not act from sectarian hatred or political ambition. He acted from a deep, painful love for his people and a desperate desire to shield them from what he saw as inevitable oppression. And when Ahmad Shah Abdali defeated the Marathas at the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, Shah Waliullah wept, not in triumph, but in relief. Yet even in this temporary reprieve, he knew the roots of revival were not in war, but in education, spiritual renewal, and justice. His message was simple, but urgent. Islam must return to its essence, or it will fade beneath the dust of empires. And so the teacher taught, the writer wrote, the reformer reformed. But time, as always, was relentless. His body was weakening, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. Students clung to every word he spoke, as if memorizing not just his teachings, but his legacy. And he had one more lesson yet to give, not with his voice, but with his final breath.
The sunset of a scholar.
The year was 1762. The monsoon rains had come early to Delhi, washing the streets in cool relief, but within the walls of Madrasa-e-Rahimiyya, there was no joy in the falling rain. The beloved teacher was fading. Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, now 59, lay on a simple mat beneath the soft flickering glow of an oil lamp. The books he had spent his life writing and teaching stood stacked along the walls. Pages fluttered gently in the breeze, like leaves of a tree preparing to shed one last time. His body, once full of energy and resolve, had grown weak. Illness crept through his limbs, slow but steady. Yet even now, in his final days, his heart beat with the rhythm of reform. His tongue whispered sister, and his mind wandered through the Quran's verses like an old friend walking a familiar path. Students and admirers filed in silently, men with turbans, ink-stained fingers, and heavy eyes. Among them were his sons, especially his eldest, Shah Abdul Aziz, who sat beside his father, holding his frail hand, memorizing the moment. He had always known this day would come, but knowing did not make it easier. "My son," Shah Waliullah whispered, voice thin as a reed, "do not let the chain break." Abdul Aziz nodded, his eyes wet. "I will teach what you taught. I will guard what you gave." A faint smile curled at Waliullah's lips. "Then I am content." Though the world outside roared with storms, political battles, court intrigues, and the slow crumbling of an empire, within that small madrasa room there was stillness. As the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had said, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." And here lay one whose ink had flowed like rivers through the parched land of India. In his last hours, Shah Waliullah recited verses from Surah Al-Asr. "By time, verily, man is in loss, except those who believe, do righteous deeds, encourage truth, and encourage patience." As twilight descended, the scholar's breath grew slower, lighter, until it ceased altogether, like a candle that had given all its light. Delhi lost a luminary that night, but Waliullah's death was not an end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, written in the hands of those he had inspired.
Echoes across centuries.
The world had moved on. The Mughal throne had crumbled, its grandeur now only dust and memory. Delhi was no longer the empire's crown, but a battlefield of foreign flags and broken dreams. Yet amid the ruins of power, something far stronger endured. The light of knowledge quietly passed from one generation to the next. Decades had passed since Shah Waliullah had returned to his Lord, but his teachings, like the Quran he had translated, remained alive. In the Madrasa-e-Rahimiyya, now under the guidance of his son Shah Abdul Aziz, the rhythm of scholarship had not ceased. The hallways still hummed with the sound of Qur'anic recitation, the discussion of usul and fiqh, the passion, but India, he declared, was now a land under non-Muslim rule. This statement sent shockwaves through the subcontinent. It was not just a legal opinion, it was a call to spiritual resistance, and that resistance took many forms. Students of Shah Waliullah's intellectual lineage went in different directions, but all carried his fire. From this lineage emerged the Deobandi movement, rooted in traditional Islamic learning, opposing colonialism and advocating for personal reform and spiritual revival. Their scholars walked barefoot across towns and villages, calling Muslims back to the Quran and Sunnah, just as Shah Waliullah had done. Others aligned with Ahli Hadith, inspired by his call to transcend rigid madhab divisions and return directly to authentic Hadith and the early generations. They too saw him as their intellectual grandfather. Still others would take his reformist principles and shape them into political action. In the 19th century, the call of Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareli, a scholar and warrior who fought in the northwestern frontier, was fueled by Shah Waliullah's vision of an Islamic state built on justice and unity. Even in the 20th century, his echoes rang in the writings of Allama Iqbal. Iqbal dreamed of spiritual and political rebirth. His influence was not just in books, it was in the bloodstream of a people. Yet for all these movements, Shah Waliullah's message was never about division. It was about integration, the intellect of reason and the fire of faith, the rules of the jurists and the longing of the Sufi, the legacy of the past and the challenge of the present. He had warned against blind imitation, but also blind rebellion. He had called for revival, but never at the expense of unity. In the modern world, where Muslim communities still grapple with disunity, secular pressure, and identity crisis, Shah Waliullah's life remains a timeless compass, not for nostalgia, but for direction, not for slogans, but for sincerity. In the end, it was not palaces or armies that preserved his name. It was the truth he lived, the vision he planted, and the souls he awakened. Even now, centuries later, in classrooms and masjids, from Delhi to Durban, Cairo to Chicago, a whisper can still be heard. Let the Quran speak to the hearts. Let the Sunnah light the path. Let knowledge reform the world. And in that whisper is the voice of Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, still teaching, still guiding, still alive.
The Revivalist's Mirror.
The world had entered a new age. Steamships cut through oceans. Telegraphs raced messages across continents. Empires expanded, and ideologies collided. For the Muslim world, this was a time of confusion, identity crumbling, colonial chains tightening, and the Ummah searching desperately for direction. In this whirlwind, thinkers and scholars, East and West, returned to a singular question. Where did we go wrong, and how do we return? And as they asked, a name kept rising from the dust of history, Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, not because he had all the answers, but because he had asked the right questions, centuries before the storm. In Egypt, Muhammad Abdu studied the legacy of reformers and saw in Waliullah a parallel, a scholar who believed that Islam and reason were not enemies, but allies. In South Asia, Maulana Maududi, decades later, would build intellectual blueprints for an Islamic system rooted in divine guidance. While their methods differed, the foundation was the same. Islam is not a relic. It is a living system that must be revived. In Turkey, in Africa, even in the scattered diasporas of Europe and America, Muslims began to rediscover scholars like Waliullah, not merely for their books, but for their model of engagement. He had spoken of ijtihad when others insisted on imitation. He had called for inter-madhab respect when others fought over jurisprudential borders. He had dared to translate the Quran for the common believer at a time when the elite guarded Arabic like a private key. And perhaps most important of all, he had woven together knowledge and spirituality, scripture and society, reason and revelation. In him, the modern seeker found a mirror, not a perfect reflection, but a challenge to rise. Could we, like him, think deeply without arrogance? Could we, like him, be critical without being destructive? Could we, like him, hold fast to the Quran while walking boldly into the future? The world he lived in was gone, but the world he foresaw was here. He had written of ethics in commerce. Today, Muslims seek halal businesses and Islamic finance. He had condemned injustice and social hierarchy. Today, his vision resonates with movements for equity and reform. He had championed sincerity and the purification of the soul. Today, seekers of truth look for spirituality beyond rituals. In every generation, Shah Waliullah's shadow appears, not to haunt, but to inspire. He was not a man of one century. He was a man of all centuries. Now, in a quiet corner of the world, a young student in a university library opens an old translation of Hujjatullah al-Baligha. She reads his words, pauses, and smiles. She does not wear a turban. She speaks no Persian. She lives in a land Shah Waliullah never imagined. But the fire in his words ignites hers. And so the revival continues.
Reflections and Lessons.
The sun set over Delhi once more. The Red Fort still stood, though its majesty had faded. The Jama Masjid echoed with the same calls to prayer that had risen in Shah Waliullah's time, but the world outside had changed, and yet some truths, like stars, shine beyond time. Inside the hearts of seekers, the story of Shah Waliullah Dehlawi lived on, not just as history, not just as a list of books or a timeline of events, but as a living torch passed from soul to soul, generation to generation. In this final chapter, we do not walk the streets of Delhi or enter the halls of his madrasa. Instead, we walk through the corridors of thought, the reflections, the lessons, and the wisdom he left behind. 1. Revival begins with the self before the reformdika. He knew that no change is real unless it begins inside. His life reminds us the greatest victory is over the self. 2. Knowledge is light, but it must be shared. He trust, a trust to be shared. Unity over division. And he said madhabs. 4. Revival must be grounded. 5. The Qur'an is the center. Those, not just in recitation, but in reflection. Not just in sound, but in meaning. He believed the Qur'an was not only for scholars, it was for the soul of every believer. As the curtain falls on his story, we remember this. He lived in a time of collapse, but he built a future. He saw darkness, but he lit a candle. He was one man, but his light touched millions, and through that light, he still speaks. The end. But his legacy continues in every classroom, every masjid, every sincere seeker of truth.
Alhamdulillah for joining us on this journey through the life of one of Islam's great scholars. We hope this story inspired your heart and deepened your connection with the rich legacy of Islamic knowledge. If you found benefit in today's episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Journey to Jannah, your home for Islamic biographies, wisdom, and timeless guidance. New episodes are uploaded regularly, so turn on the notification bell to never miss a moment of insight. May Allah increase us all in beneficial knowledge and guide us on the path of the righteous. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.